Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. Today we're going to bring you a replay of our tutorial Twinkle. This was originally released as a pattern that is part of our Stashin' with Stephanie Club, where we send you a bundle of fabric with a pattern inspired by it to use each month. And eventually some of those end up in a book. And this one ended up in Fat Quarter Workshop, 12 Skill Building Patterns. This has been a bestseller on Amazon in the quilts and quilting category, but you can get a signed copy if you order it from our website. The original version, that fabric is long gone, but we reimagined it in Little Forester from Art Gallery, and I think it turned out really cute and fun. We just did a crib size version because I thought that this fabric was really fun and cute and perfect for a little baby or toddler quilt because we've got the cute little animals and they're just really fun. What makes this quilt work really well for this collection is it's really designed to work with a collection where you have a good amount of light fabrics and the background and a good amount of darks, because sometimes when you have a lot of light or medium, it doesn't contrast really well with your background fabric, so it's really hard to get it to look nice and have a definable block. So in this one, what we do is it's like two stars colliding together, and so we use all those light and medium prints in the center squares, and then we've got some half square triangles that make up those colliding stars to give it really good contrast with your background. And it's these little paw prints. It's really cute. It's very adorable. So if you know somebody who is expecting, this is a really good one to do. For this kit, since it's so small because it's sized for a crib, we're going to give you everything you need for the top, the binding, and the backing fabric. And we're going to have two backing fabrics for you to choose from. The first one is this cute, adorable little squirrel print. It is so fun. It's part of the collection. And we also have a butterfly one that you can choose from as well. So you can pick wall supplies last to see which one you like best and go with that. And then you'll want to get a copy of Fat Quarter Workshop. So in this tutorial, we talk about color value of fabrics and placing things correctly. We also really go over how to do your half square triangles well and why I press all my seams open to get those sharp points exactly where we want them to be and have them look absolutely fantastic. So with that in mind, let's watch. And if you've got a bundle at home that's just got a whole lot of light fabric in it, but you love it and you want to use it somehow, this is a great pattern to use this with. Or you can grab our brand new kit as we reimagine this quilt Twinkle in Little Forester.
So I got a little excited when I was making this quilt, and I've already made all my half square triangles for the quilt. So you're gonna see the pinked edges here from a sample I got when I ordered this at Quilt Market. Yours are not gonna have pinked edges. You're gonna have nice straight edges. So keep that in mind when you're doing this, that yours will not look like mine when we get started with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our background, which is this nice lighter with the gold metallic, and you're going to just flip it so that the wrong side is up. Then you're going to take your ruler, and again, you would line this up point to point. It's kind of hard to tell point to point when it's all pinked edges like this, but we're going to do our best here. But you would just line it up with that center, and then I just mark that with my friction gel pen. You could use a pencil because this is going to be in the seam allowance. It's not like anyone's ever going to see it, but I find it's easier to do it if you kind of work from the center out, and you don't need to go over it as many times as I am. I'm just doing it a little darker so you guys can see it on camera. Now I'm going to go ahead and lay these guys right sides together, and I don't typically pin this because I have made probably hundreds of thousands of half square triangles using this method. But if you wanted to pin across here and across here. The reason why you want to pin across where we're going to be sewing instead of over here is because what matters is keeping your points together, because that's how we end up with an accurately sized unit when we're all done. If you were to pin over here, it would be really easy for your points to shift, and then you might end up having some issues later on. So what we're going to do next is we're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam down both sides of this drawn line. So to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam, you're just going to set your sewing machine up to sew a 1/4 inch, and then most sewing machines you can just move your needle one needle position to the right, and then that will give you that scant 1/4 inch seam. If your machine will not do that, just sew with your foot instead of right on this line, with it lined up with the edge, you want it to be just a little hair over. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab my foot here and just show you what it's going to look like. So normally we would line the edge of our fabric up with the edge of our presser foot when we're sewing. In this case, we're going to line it up with that line, and we're going to sew this as though it had already been cut apart, but it's all together for now. And the reason why we sew first and cut second is because this is a bias, so it can stretch pretty easily on you. But if you sew it all together first and then cut it apart, you're keeping some stability in there because it's still attached to fabric on the other side. But if we cut it first and then sew it, then this is much more likely to stretch, and then your half square triangles may not turn out the size they're supposed to be. Let's get started sewing. All right, so I'm just sewing the way I normally would, except instead of lining my press foot up with the edge of my fabric, I'm lining it up with that line that we drew. And I just kind of hold the tips of my corners together. But again, you could always pin that if that makes you feel more comfortable. Now, when I get down to the end here, a lot of times people will end up with like a smiley or frowny face. And it's because they're not maintaining their 1/4 inch seam from start to finish. So what I like to do when I can't hold this tip anymore is just put my finger just to the right and let that just guide up. That way I'm able to maintain that 1/4 inch seam the entire way down, make sure that I'm going nice and straight and that that line stays even with the edge of my press foot all the way through to the end. The other thing I've seen people do that screws us up is they like to sew instead of using their presser foot to start stop, using the start stop button on their sewing machine. The problem with that is it all goes one speed, so you're not able to slow down when you get to the end the way you need to in order to maintain that accurate stitch. So use your presser foot and then use your finger as a guide to help maintain that 1/4 inch stitch all the way down. Now, if you're doing a bunch of these, and I recommend you do this all at once, you're going to just lift this up, feed in another one, and chain stitch all the way down. We're just going to do one for the video, so I'm just going to lift that up, turn it around, and then line my presser foot up with the other side of that now. And now I'm just still going to sew straight down the center, but on the other side of the line that I drew. All right, so it's a little hard to see because it's white thread on a white fabric, but we've now sewn down both sides of that drawn line. If I flip it over, we can see a little better that it is nice and white thread on there. You can always measure to make sure you've done this right. You should be at a 1/2 inch or maybe a hair under if you've sewn that scant 1/4 inch seam correctly. I'm just a hair under in this case, so that means I am good to go. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and flip this back over so I can see that line that I drew. And I'm just going to use my rotary cutter to slice right down the center of that line. It doesn't matter if you are super accurate at this point because we already have the accuracy from sewing that scant 1/4 inch seam. But you don't want to get too skinny and have less than 1/8 of an inch on either side of that seam allowance because that can pop apart with use or sometimes when you're quilting it on the long arm. So do be careful of that, but if you're not perfectly on the line that you drew when you cut it apart, that's not the end of the world. So now you can see we've got 2 half square triangles for the price of 1. So it's really fast and convenient and a great way to get really accurately sized triangles, but we still have a couple more things to do before these are ready to sew into our quilt. So I really like to press all my seams open. I find that I get really great joins, especially with all these points. And to do that, I just kind of open that seam up and sort of finger press it open with 3 fingers ahead of the iron. Then with my iron tip straight down that center seam, I just press across. And your seam should be nice and straight. If you lined a ruler up next to it, they would still be very straight. You don't want to have where you have like curves coming up or down. That means that you didn't maintain that 1/4 inch stitch all the way down, and that's why you're having trouble. And you also don't want to see any wiggles. That means that there is a pleat on the other side. So I'm just going to go ahead and flip that over, and I like to just press from the other side as well just to get it super, super flat. Now we've got to trim this down, and this is a step that is really easy to skip because you think, well, why would I do that? But it makes a huge difference in getting all your pieces to be the right size, which means your quilt is not going to be lumpy or bumpy. It's just going to be nice and flat when you put it all together. And you're also going to trim off some of those dog ears, which will make quilting easier as well. I did one quilt where I didn't trim anything, and it was just a hot mess getting it all together. And then I learned after that, I was like, yep, there's some reasons why they tell you to trim this down. There's definitely a reason for that. All right, so what we're gonna do in order to trim this accurately is the first line I line up is always the 45-degree line. That line needs to be exactly on that seam line. If it's off like this, then that means that your seam is not going to be going to your corner, and any amount of pinning you ever do isn't going to fix it because it's never going to line up correctly the way it should. So always line that up first, then make sure you've got some fabric hanging off past the measurement you need to cut to, as well as beyond the side of the ruler. Once you're happy with that, place your whole hand down on the ruler and just cut your right and your top side. If you're left-handed, it's going to be your left and your top side. We can move those to the side. I'm going to give it a 180-degree flip. Now this time, I'm going to line up the measurement that I'm supposed to be trimming to exactly with the edges that I just trimmed. And then I sew that 45-degree line going right down that seam allowance because that is still the most important line. Go ahead and give it another trim. And now we have a half square triangle that is exactly the size we need it to be. The seams are going straight out to the point, and so all those points are going to come together really beautifully when we go to assemble our block. So go ahead and do that for all the half square triangles for this quilt. There's going to be a combination of ones where you're combining your focal print with your background, as well as ones where you're combining two focal prints. So do that. All the instructions are in the pattern to go along with this. It's called Twinkle, and it's available at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, and we have it for multiple sizes. So depending on what you need to make this for, you can get exactly what you need for that. So I've got the top row of my block laid out and ready to sew together, and we're going to do this one because we have got 2 points to come together. There aren't that many points that you have to join well in each block. Really, there's only 4 in each block, so it's not that intimidating, but I wanted to show you how to do that and how I would sew these together in order to join my rows first, and then we're going to join the rest of our block together, and I'll give you the tips and tricks along the way so that way you can have a perfectly flat block as well when you're doing this at home. So first off, when I'm doing this at home, I lay out everything right next to my sewing machine, so I've got my entire block that I'm just assembling one at a time. It's kind of fun because you can kind of mix up and have as scrappy of a look as you can possibly get. I tried not to repeat fabrics too much, and then what I did was I would sew everything that was in the last 2 vertical rows together first. So I would have done this one and then the 2 that were on the end in the second row, and so on until I had my entire block together. And this one we just had the 1 row, so I'm going to lay these guys right sides together. Also, one thing to note here is I kept alternating the direction of where these are going, because technically this is a directional print that we are working with here. And in order to avoid having it look like, you know, we messed up, I basically, every other block, I would have my corners going up, and then in the next block that I laid together, I would have my corners going out. And so then whatever was next to it, so in this case there's one here, this is a vertical one, so I've got this one going horizontally. And then when you put them together, you can arrange them so that they're all just going in a mishmash of a way, but it's kind of planned just a little bit, so that way it looks like sort of organized chaos, which is what you want in a scrappy quilt. All right, so I'm just going to arrange these guys right sides together. I typically don't pin these because we're just sewing squares together, and there are a lot of instances in which we're just sewing squares together in this block. But if you feel more comfortable doing that, by all means, please do. What I do is I just kind of get it started, and then I hold my corners together with my fingertip. I'll sew down to the bottom, and then I will move my finger again to the left this time to maintain that 1/4 inch stitch all the way down. Now again, I would just pick up the next row, the 2 on the far side, and I would just keep on chain stitching all those together. And then what I like to do is lay everything back out. That way I know that everything is exactly where it's supposed to be and it's looking the way it's supposed to. So I would have gotten this entire row done. And then I'm going to move on to the ones that are kind of in the middle here. Now for this one, we have to pin it a specific way in order to keep these points together. So first I'm going to align those guys right sides together. Then looking at it from above, I'm going to line it up so that those seams are right on top of each other. This one is really easy to tell because you've got dark prints on one side and light prints on the other. And then I'm going to put a pin on the side of this seam that I'm going to sew last. So in this case, it is the right side of that seam allowance. So that way I can sew all the way down to here. And when I get my needle in the first half of that seam allowance, I can pull that pin out, and then that needle will kind of act like a pin until I can sew the rest of the way so that we have a great join. All right, so I'm just kind of sewing. I'm holding that bottom part again. I'm going to slow down as I come to that seam. Now with my needle down in the first half of that seam allowance, I'm going to go ahead and pull that pin, put my finger to the side to maintain that 1/4 inch stitch, and stitch all the way down. Now is the moment of truth where we take a peek and see how that turned out, and it is pretty good. That seam is coming together really well. It's going to look great once we press that open. Now at this point, I don't typically press until I have all of my rows together. So at this point, I would lay it back out again, make sure that everything for all the rows are in the right spot. Then I'm going to go ahead and flip it right sides together with the little one that we have left there on the corner. And I'm going to sew these guys together. And again, I would chain piece, just going all the way down the block for all the other rows as well. In this case, we are just going to lay it out again, making sure that everything is going correctly. You know, we've got in the corners, our arrows are going right up and down. And so we've got this one in the right spot too, because it's going right up and down the corner. So I go ahead and flip these guys right sides together, line up my corners, and do one more seam, and then our top row is together. Now, just like with the half square triangles, I'm going to go ahead and press these seams open. The difference is I like to sort of lift and press because we have, in this case, a lot of seams going in different directions for those half square triangles. So I don't want to accidentally press them going the wrong way. So I'm just going to lift my iron up and set it back down. That way I don't accidentally get something going the wrong direction. Once I have everything pressed from the wrong side, I like to just go over it as well, from the right side as well. And with this is just a really fabulous join. Everything is coming together well. The point is nice and flat. There's no bulk to it. And it's because we pressed all those seams open, which means it's going to be really flat, really pretty, and it opens up your quilting possibilities a lot as well because you're able to quilt right into that without worrying about breaking the needle. Just to prove how large this block is, I can't even fit the whole thing on my overhead camera. We can only see the first kind of 4 rows. It's a really big block, so it goes really fast. So I'm going to show you how I pin these together, and I'm going to start with my bottom 2 rows here, or actually I'll start with these rows here because this is an instance in which we are going to have those triangles coming together. So I'm going to show you how to do that so that way the points match absolutely perfectly. So we're going to start just by flipping them right sides together. This is another reason why I absolutely love pressing my seams open because I can see right here where the seam is coming together. So I can see that this is the top of my triangle. So I'm going to put my pin in right at the tip of the triangle, right through the center of that seam. And then I'm going to find the tip of the triangle beneath it and put my pin in again right at that triangle tip, right through that center of that seam that's pressed open. Now I'm going to pinch this with that pin going straight up and down and taking a second pin in that seam allowance on the right side. Reason why I use a separate pin is if I were to rock this pin back and forth, I would just move my top fabric forward and my bottom fabric toward me. Those points would no longer be right on top of each other. Now I can remove this pin, and when I'm stitching, I can just sew right down the side here, and as long as I'm 1 needle width to the right of where that triangle comes together, everything is going to be absolutely perfect when it's joined. Now for the rest of this, I can just go ahead and line up those seams right on top of each other and just pin in the right side of the seam allowance. You've got these 2 from the top row. You've got 2 again on the bottom row, so you'll do those when you're sewing your rows together. And then you have the 2 that we just pinned together. And then when we join these 2 rows at the end, that'll be your 4th triangle point that you have to pay attention to. And then when we join our blocks, there are no triangle points to match. So it is really a very easy block. If you just want to give half square triangles a go for the first time, this is a good one to give it a try on because you just don't have to do it that much. It's not like you're going to make hundreds of thousands and all the points have to be perfect. You can just give it a try, see how it goes, and I bet you're gonna like it. I'm gonna go ahead and pin these bottom rows as well. In this case, we don't have any points to match here. There's no points that are gonna be coming together. I just need to make sure that I'm sewing that 1/4 inch seam so I don't lose this point or this point here. And so I can just join those seams and pin and sew.
Whenever I'm sewing these, I kind of will go a little bit faster in between seams, but as I get to those seams, especially the ones that have points that I want to worry about, I want to slow down and be really deliberate about it and make sure that my needle is one needle width to the right of where any of those triangles are. And then once I've got my needle down the first half of the seam allowance, pull the pin, and then that needle kind of acts like a pin, holding everything in place. But otherwise, you just want to maintain your 1/4 inch seam as you're going. When you get to the first half of the seam allowance, stop your needle down, pull your pin, and you'll be good to go. I'm also going to press these row seams open, again making sure to lift and press because we have a lot of seams at this point. We don't want to press anything going the wrong way as we do this. And as long as you kind of have your fingers advanced to sort of finger press that open as you go, it goes pretty easily. And once you get the hang of it, it is super, super simple to do. Let's go ahead and flip that over, see how we did. Oh, pretty good, pretty good. It could be a little better, but I'm going to call that good. The points are coming together really well. I could have moved it a little bit to the side, but I'm happy with that. I'm going to let it be. So I'm going to go ahead and press it from the right side. And then that one's ready to go. I'm going to press my other one. And then I normally don't show you how to assemble the entire block because at this point you're just putting stuff together and sewing long seams. And it's no different than what we just did. But I will show you how I pinned the next bit because I found it to be a big time saver. So I'm going to press this and then I'll show you the pinning. And then you have everything you need to know to make this quilt. So even though we can't see the entire block on this overhead camera, you can tell that there's an odd number of rows in this block. And so far we've got a set of 2 together, set of 2 together, and then we just have one all in its lonesome. So what I did is I pinned both of these at once, so that way I could just sew both sides and then press it once. And I found it to be a great time saver, but it matters what order you pin them in. That way you can make sure that you don't accidentally sew down something that you don't need to. So we're going to ignore this bottom one for right now. And we're first going to pin the single row from the top to the double rows that are our second and third rows. Alright, so I've got the top row pinned, and it's not going to be anywhere near where we're going to be stitching on this side, which is very important because that means we're going to stitch this one second, so that way it's out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and flip these guys right sides together. I've got my bottom 2 rows that are now attaching to my third row. I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to pin this side together. And this is going to be the first seam that we sew because we can sew this side without worrying about getting this caught, and then I can open up the block and stitch that side. And it really is a really great time saver when you're putting together this block. So this is it. This is our gigantic block for Twinkle. And again, it looks like there's 2 stars kind of colliding into each other, hence the name. And it's a fun one to make. It goes super fast because we have rather large pieces that we are working with. And also you have a big block, so you can just get it together and move on to the next one. And the one that we did, that was the full-size double quilt, that was just 16 blocks, so that it just went so fast. I was able to get all the blocks together in 2 days. It took another couple of days to get my half square triangles ready to go, but it was a really fast quilt, really fun, and it's great if you either need something quick to get together for a gift, or you just want something that's going to challenge you a little bit, where you can get sort of a taste of those half square triangles without being totally overwhelmed by them. Thanks so much for following along, and until next week, happy quilting.